On Weird History Food, we're looking at how big business really built the food pyramid.
Ain't surprised.
Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History Food channel. And let us know in the comments below what other corporate conspiracies you'd like to hear about. Okay, time to decipher these American food hieroglyphs. In the mid-1800s, Wilbur Olin Atwater was a revolutionary nutritionist. He earned his PhD in agricultural chemistry from Yale University, and his thesis on maize was the first ever modern chemical analysis of a food to be performed in the United States. It was pretty amazing.
Wow.
From there, he landed himself a job teaching chemistry at Wesleyan University, where he conducted landmark experiments on agriculture and, eventually, nutrition. It wasn't long before the U.S. government, like ice cream, scooped him up. And by the late 1870s, Atwater was conducting experiments on the nutritive value of fish and other invertebrates for the U.S. Fish Commission, along with studies on meat consumption for the Smithsonian Institution. He was considered the nation's leading nutritionist, and the United States Department of Agriculture even allowed him to speak on their behalf in an 1894 publication of Farmer's Bulletin. It was the talk of 1894. Therein, Atwater wrote, "The evils of overeating may not be felt at once, but sooner or later they are sure to appear. Perhaps in an excessive amount of fatty tissue, perhaps in general debility, perhaps in actual disease." Judging by his feelings about the evils of overeating, it's a good thing Atwater didn't live to see the invention of pizza delivery. The publication marked a turning point for the USDA. After being founded in 1862, the USDA had previously abstained from doling out nutritional advice. But like any nagging Nancy can tell you, once you start giving out advice, it can be hard to know when to stop. Just 2 years later, Atwater would go on to publish his magnum opus, The Chemical Composition of American Food Materials. Everyone remembers where they were the day that book dropped. This nutritional guide documented the fuel value, or caloric content, of everyday foods, along with their fat, carb, and protein contents. However, scientists at the time didn't have a good grasp on exactly how vitamins and minerals affected the body, and so they were left out of Atwater's guide altogether. Regardless, Atwater's guide would act as the primary handbook for the USDA's recommendations for decades to come. In other words, a single man was dictating the government's position on nutrition. That is, until the food rationing of World War II. In 1943, the USDA created the first predecessor to the food pyramid. It was pretty basic. In fact, it was called the Basic Seven. Divided into 7 different categories, this chart attempted to steer people away from malnutrition during wartime food shortages. It consisted of equal parts: 1. Green and yellow vegetables; 2. Oranges, tomatoes, and grapefruit; 3. Potatoes and other vegetables and fruits; 4. Milk and milk products; 5. Meat, poultry, fish, or eggs; 6. Bread, flour, and cereals; and 7. Butter and fortified margarine. That's the most powerful margarine. In addition, they also included a disclaimer that invited citizens to eat any other foods you want, which seems like it negates the entire purpose of the wheel. Guess you could fling it around with your friends or something. At the time, nutritionists criticized the wheel for giving each category equal space on the wheel, making it look like 1/7 of a person's diet should be entirely butter. Wait, it's not supposed to be? Still, varieties of fresh produce appeared in 3 of the basic 7 groups, and noticeably, bread, flour, and cereals only appeared in 1. 13 years later, the USDA would update their guidelines for the post-war era. Still trying to fight off malnutrition, they came up with the Daily Food Guide for Thrifty Families, which at this time consisted of just 4 basic groups. Vegetables and meats would get a visual bump, taking up more space on the chart than the milk and bread categories. While, tragically, butter and margarine melted off the chart completely. The Daily Food Guide was only meant to show the minimum amount of each category that a person should eat in one day. It wasn't until 1980 that the USDA fully matured into its nagging Nancy stage.
The food wheel.
While early nutritional guides fixated on solving malnutrition and keeping people from starvation, America began to face an all-new problem as the 50s turned into the 60s. People were putting on too much weight, and the government needed to put a stop to it. As concerns around both obesity and dietary-related cancers grew into the 1970s, the USDA came under pressure to be more specific with their dietary guidelines and to tell people exactly what they should and should not eat. So, in 1980, they released the Food Wheel. their first stab at spelling out the precise portions of which foods a person should consume on any given day. Under the new guidelines, vegetables were suddenly on the outs, and breads and grains rose in prominence. The USDA suggested that veggies should make up 20% of a person's diet, while breads and grains should make up closer to 40%. All the while, both the recommended meat and fruit intake fell to a mere 10% each. It was a carb lover's dream, but a dietitian's nightmare. So, what happened? In the 1970s, there was an indiscriminate push against fat. Without any substantial scientific evidence, many came to believe that all fats were bad and all complex carbs were good. What's more, they thought that replacing meat and dairy with bread and cereal was the best move you could make if you wanted to live into an old age. They didn't discriminate between the healthy fats that lower cholesterol and the unhealthy fats that give you heart disease. So they threw their fat baby out with its fatty bathwater, and they ditched fats altogether. At the time, though, scientists were already aware of distinctions between different types of fats. Research had been conducted in the 60s and 70s that demonstrated the nutritional disparities between consuming saturated and unsaturated fats. And it was common knowledge among nutritionists that there were distinct differences between the two. These in-the-know nutritionists likewise sounded the alarm on the impending health catastrophe that inflating these two fats would cause. But their warnings went unheard. The argument was that it was better to give the public a simple, easy-to-follow guide than to weigh a guideline down with nuances. Therefore, all fat must be labeled bad, because they believed the average citizen wouldn't be able to understand that there were different kinds of fat. Consumers believed the message, and they sought out as many low-fat and zero-fat products as they could find, ignoring other vital factors in the process, like sugar content. The food industry responded, and they began to sell all sorts of low-fat or zero-fat cookies, chips, and other junk foods, making up for the loss of flavor from the loss of fat by adding in sucrose and high-fructose corn syrup.
Kill somebody.
By the 1990s, the anti-fat pro-carbs movement was firmly cemented in the American conscience. Even organizations like the American Heart Association hopped aboard the misinformation train. They advocated for limiting fat-based caloric intake to 30% of one's daily diet, while increasing the number of calories individuals got from carbs to make up for it. According to Scientific American, however, this 30% figure, which became standard nutritional guidance for well over a decade to come, was based on no long-term studies and was instead built off of several Surgeon General, National Research Council, and Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee reports. Likewise, studies of the early 1990s showed that replacing calories from saturated fats with calories from carbohydrates did nothing to reduce the risk of heart disease. And replacing calories from unsaturated fats proved to be an even worse catastrophe. Cutting out unsaturated fats and replacing them with carbs both increased the risk of heart disease and increased rates of obesity. However, none of this stopped the government from moving full steam ahead with even more recommendations. And in 1992, the USDA unveiled their first ever food guideline pyramid. At the pyramid's pinnacle, with a disclaimer of use sparingly, were fats, oils, and sweets, all lumped together in one dismal peak. Below that were equal small portions of dairies and proteins, slightly larger portions of vegetables and fruits, and a gigantic base of bread. Just tons and tons of bread. According to this pyramid, you should try to harvest half a wheat field with your teeth each day. The government then distributed this pyramid via posters and textbooks that went into schools the nation over, and they began to inculcate the children of the 90s and the aughts with their ready vision for the world. With this increased governmental guidance, obesity levels continued to rise, almost doubling from their 1980 levels by the new millennium. Enter the food lobby. Angered by their small share of the 1992 food pyramid, the Dairy Council stepped up their pressure on government bureaucrats to increase their recommended dairy consumption. Likewise, as people cried foul over the lack of differentiation between good fats and bad fats, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association fought hard against them to keep red meats in the same meaty catch-all as chicken and fish. For their part, Atkins Nutritionals Inc., hell-bent on reducing America's carbohydrate intake, began to pour money into campaigns that would reduce the USDA's future carby guidelines. Against them, though, were the American Millers Association, who wanted to keep starchy potatoes in with the rest of the vegetable category. In 2005, with all this outside pressure and with money being thrown in every direction, the USDA tried again. They created the all-new My Pyramid Food Guidance System, an aesthetically vague rendition of their 1992 pyramid, but one that included a little guy walking up the side, to encourage people to exercise. This new pyramid, while still pushing people to gorge themselves on bread, encouraged the consumption of
So they
whole
weren't doing
grains
that at the
instead of
beginning?
processed grains. What's more, it pushed dairy to a whopping 23% share of the new dietary guidelines, doubling what they'd recommended just 13 years prior, and raising questions over the food lobby's influence on the guidelines. My Pyramid also replaced the previously vague recommended servings with actual ounce and cup recommendations for each of its 6 categories. And it likewise associated each of these categories with 6 themes for everyone to remember: personalization, gradual improvement, physical activity, variety, moderation, and proportionality. In the years
Yeah,
since the
they're
1980
doing
creation
trial
of the
and error
food wheel,
with this
obesity
food wheel.
rates in the United States have nearly tripled. But in 2011, after 19 years of spreading misinformation, the food pyramid was taken down for good. It
Okay.
was replaced with the USDA's My Plate campaign, which is still in use today. My Plate breaks
Makes
dietary
sense.
guidelines down into just 5 basic categories: fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins, and dairy. Noticeably absent is the butter category, which
Thank
we are
God.
still lobbying to bring back. Reversing their 2005 decision to encourage milk consumption, dairy now takes up the smallest visual portion of the 5. Still, according to the USDA, My Plate isn't actually meant to give specific one-size-fits-all dietary guidelines, but to serve as a reminder for healthy eating. But if you do want dietary guidelines, the USDA releases a new set of them every few years. Their Dietary Guidelines for Americans, 2020 to 2025, is the most recent edition. However, since the 2010 Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, food industry lobbyists have been able to spend busloads of money on political campaigns, further influencing the ways the USDA conducts its business, including how they set their guidelines. For example, when the USDA released its dietary guidelines for Americans in 2015, it promoted levels of dairy and red meat consumption that alarmed many nutrition experts, including some the government had hired to create the guidelines. In fact, the guidelines flat out contradicted some of the information in the report from the Dietary
So
Guidelines
they know what they're
Advisory
doing.
Committee, that team of
Basically.
experts we mentioned earlier who were meant to advise the USDA on nutrition. Notably, the report
Oh,
recommended
good,
eating
Brian.
less red meat because of research linking meat-heavy diets with heart disease and cancer. In that same year alone, Coca-Cola spent nearly $9 million on lobbying. The entire meat industry spent almost $5 million, and the broader agricultural industry spent just shy of $20 million. And during the 2020 elections, the food lobby as a whole spent a whopping $175 million on political contributions.
That's
Listen,
crazy.
you cannot fill America's schools with lucrative Coke machines unless you grease the right palms. And the USDA's happen to be the right palms
Oh,
to
our
grease.
people fat
The
now.
most outspoken critics have pointed out that the USDA is a government entity concerned with food production rather than nutrition, and argue that as such, the USDA is never going to release guidelines suggesting that people eat less of the country's biggest food industries. Everyone wants a piece of the government, and now more than ever before, outside influences can affect future USDA guidance. So, before swallowing the government's recommendations on what to put in our mouths, we may want to chew on who is behind those recommendations. So what do you think? Do you follow the food pyramid? Let
Nope.
us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our Weird History Food.
Okay. That was a good video. They just basically try and error with everybody really at that point. Because I remember food pyramids when I was in school growing up all the way to, I want to say, high school and college. They got rid of it. Like I said, 2011, they got rid of the pyramid, the food pyramid. I was in high school about 2012, I say, 2012. But they, man, them people, they all about money, to be honest, at the end of the day. Because it's no way that the fruits and vegetables should have been that low percentage. It should have been a higher percentage for the fruits and vegetables. But hey, anything for them to make $1, they'll do it. So that was wild. I hope y'all enjoyed that video. Hope y'all learned something. I know I did. Your boy Church Boy V. I'm out. Know that God love you. Know that I love you. Y'all take care. Have a blessed day. Peace.